Good evening, everyone. My name is Sadie Thayer, and I'm the director here at the Kittitas County Historical Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's event. We're gathered here to learn more about the topic, come together and experience to share ideas and walk away hopefully with greater understanding of the topic at hand. So I just want to share a courtesy reminder for everyone in the audience. Please keep the conversation civil afterwards and respectful to the presenter, to others in the audience as you share your ideas, and to museum staff, so we can all have an enjoyable experience. As we begin tonight's event, I first would like to recognize that we're gathered together on the historic homelands of the Kittitas and Piscataway peoples, and recognize that today these bands are part of the Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, a federally recognized Native nation constituted under the Treaty with the Yakimas of 1855. The Indigenous stewards of this land practices a subsistence lifestyle through fishing, hunting, and gathering since time immemorial, and remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it, protecting it, and using it as instructed by their elders through generations, and actively practicing the traditions and culture as neighbors in the Ellensburg community. We are especially thankful to the Kittitas and Piscataway people who have allowed us to learn from and share their stories and traditions with visitors from all across the world, as we serve as the cultural custodians of their basketry, beadwork, and other items. And for those of you interested in learning more about that, please check out the display at the back of the room. Before we can go into tonight's event, this is the last of the spring's presentations before we go on a summer hiatus and come back in the fall. All of our presentations are made possible by our membership and through partnerships with like Humanities Washington. So if you're a member in the audience tonight, I especially want to thank you for your membership and your support of our lecture series, but I want to thank everyone for their support. But if you're not a member yet, I highly encourage you to become one. After tonight's program, we will ask you to fill out a small survey so that we and our presenter can receive relevant feedback. It's important to have this information so we all can learn how to provide a great lecture series. So tonight's program is presented by Maria Spagna. Thank you. I forgot to ask you how you pronounce that. She is the author of 9 books, including the one you're all here to learn about tonight, Pushed, Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre. Her work has been recognized by the River Teeth Literary Nonfiction Prize, the Society for Environmental Journalists, the Nautilus Book Award, and as a 4-time finalist for the Washington State Book Awards. As a former backcountry trails worker, she now teaches in the MFA or Master of Fine Arts programs at Antioch University, Los Angeles, and Western Colorado University. So please join me in welcoming Maria.
Thank you to Sadie, and thank you so much to the museum for welcoming me here, and most of all, to all of you for coming indoors on this lovely spring evening to learn more about this topic. The journey that I went on to learn about these supposed massacre at Chelan Falls along the Columbia took me 5 years. And along that way, I didn't learn a whole lot from the internet. I didn't learn a whole lot from existing published sources. You know who I learned a lot from? People like you. I learned local historical societies in our region were crucial, local museum staff, and just beloved patrons were crucial to me. And so I admire the work that Sadie does. I admire the work that you all do by coming here and learning and sharing what you know. And I will give away at the end of the book, I still hope you read it, that it remains a mystery what happened at Chelan Falls. And yet, every time I come and I talk to a group like this, I think there's someone sitting there that knows something. So if you know something, raise that hand, right? I like to be interrupted, and I look forward to learning what you know, as well as sharing what I know. My plan is to read a little bit from the book. That gives you some background, to show some slides so you get some images of these Chinese miners and early settlers of our region. And also, as I said, to generate some conversation, to see the things that you're thinking about. I do like to be interrupted. We will have time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'm actually going to step back for a minute from our region and from the Chinese miners and talk about a previous book of mine. So this was the first book of mine that took me into real serious historical research. And it was based on a family myth that my dad, Joseph Spagna, who's the white man in the picture, had been a hero in the civil rights movement, that he had been involved in the Tallahassee bus boycott in Florida, which took place at the same time as the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama. They had ridden a bus with a couple of his Black friends, had been arrested, and they'd taken their case to the Supreme Court. My dad died when I was 11, and one thing that happens when your parent dies when you're young is that the stories you hear about them get very glorified. And so I will be frank and say I thought this was nonsense. But I began research, and it was not nonsense at all. It was absolutely true. Every part of the story I just told you was true. And the way that I was able to track down the story was simply by looking for the people who knew my dad. I went through phone books and I wrote letters. First, I tried email, but these were going to be men in their 70s and 80s, and email was not going to work. And so I hand wrote letters to anybody who had the same name, and lo and behold, I got responses. I met these people who had been involved in the movement with my dad. I was able to go to Tallahassee and celebrate the anniversary of that boycott. I got to meet Congressman John Lewis, who's one of the heroes of our time. And this book was so gratifying and so just made me so happy and proud. And it made me wildly overconfident as I came into this project, because that project is about people who are still alive. This project is about people who are no longer with us, the Chinese miners. There are also no firsthand written accounts of what happened. Partially because of language barriers, partially because of issues of oppression and whose story gets remembered, partially just things get lost through the cracks of time, as we all know, as museum lovers. Also, there was only, as I would find, though I saw smatterings of this story everywhere, there was one article that reported the event in the Spokane Spokesman at the time. And it came out 17 years after the supposed event. So I was up against it with friends. And nevertheless, I forged on. This is a slide that I need very many places where I talk. I don't need it as much here, but this is our region, of course. And when I'm talking about Chelan Falls, if you've ever been to Chelan, we have Lake Chelan there in the middle of the map, and the Columbia River coming down, and Chelan Falls is just below where the Chelan River comes down. And there's a, as I'll talk about in a minute, there's a PUD park, a campground called BB Bridge Park, right across from where the Chelan River comes in. This is where the massacre supposedly took place. And I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit from the prologue so you see how the journey began for me and what I knew at the beginning or thought I knew. So this is from the prologue. A few years ago, while waiting for the ferry to Stehekin, I should mention that I live in Stehekin, Washington. Do people know where Stehekin is? Yes, Stehekin's at the upper end of Lake Chelan. You have to take a ferry to get there. So we spent a lot of time waiting for the ferry. A few years ago, while waiting for the ferry to Stehekin, I browsed the shelves at Riverwalk Books in Chelan and picked up a paperback titled Wacato Heritage, The History of the Chelan and Indiat Indians by Tom Hackenmiller, another amateur historian in Wenatchee. As I read and reread the book, one story snagged my attention. This one wasn't about the original inhabitants, or not them alone. In the late 1860s, a Chinese merchant settled on the bank of the Columbia River directly across from Chelan Falls, where BB Bridge Park now sits. The merchant ran a thriving business, the first of its kind along this rugged upper stretch of river, and he catered to Indigenous, Chinese, and white people alike. But within a decade, tensions grew heated. One day on a high bluff within view of the store, according to lore, a group of Indigenous people murdered a large number of Chinese miners, perhaps as many as 300, and pushed the bodies over a cliff into the Columbia. Locals dubbed the event the Chelan Falls Massacre. A massacre, perhaps as many as 300 killed. Why had I never heard this story? The truth is, I've never even heard about Chinese gold miners along the Columbia, though I should have. I knew very little about Chinese people in the American West, though I've lived here my entire life. But I did know BB Bridge Park, a flat grassy campground constructed in the mid-90s, popular with RVers in summer. I'd often camped there on my way to or from the once-a-day ferry. BB Bridge had always seemed a nondescript, in-between sort of place. To think of BB Bridge as historically relevant felt surprising, astonishing even, a welcome challenge to assumptions I didn't even know I held. This simple connection at first spurred me on. Over time, the story grew more complicated. Not long after beginning research in earnest, I began to hear another theory about the Chelan Falls Massacre. First, as a scandalous whisper, you know what they say. Then, as a steady hum, sons and daughters of the sons and daughters of the first white settlers voiced the possibility. The attackers weren't Indigenous people. They were white men dressed up to look Indigenous. The possibility infuriated me. Of course, xenophobia isn't innate, but instilled, a political tool, an excuse. None of this was new. None of this could be substantiated. And because the facts remain so murky, I've learned, some historians believe this massacre never occurred at all. Suddenly, a made-up massacre seemed possible too. If a place comes to own you, does its history own you too? I believe it does. I've read 1,000 pages and driven hundreds of miles trying to figure out the truth about this forgotten massacre. I used to think of forgetting as benign, such a gentle verb to forget. Now I am not so sure. I own land in Chelan County. I've benefited as much as anyone and more than most from the murders of non-white people. The sin of forgetting is at least partly mine. So call this a remembering, a search with no end, a river with multiple sloughs. A group of Indigenous people massacred a few Chinese men, or 300 of them, or white men massacred them, or it didn't happen at all. Tributaries trickle and flood and sometimes run dry. Who believes which story and why? Why tell the story at all? Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished, Chief Sealth famously said, or may have said, in 1854 in response to a proposed treaty. Even the rocks, which seem to be dim and dead as they swelter in the sun along the silent shore, throw with memories of stirring events. It's a perspective we either romanticize or dismiss, but rarely acknowledge as plain fact or plain lack. We've lost the sense of comfort and complicity such connection can spawn, and maybe one way to nurture understanding, to suture some semblance of wholeness, is to unbury stories of what humans did right here. So that's where I began. And as I mentioned in there, I was woefully ignorant about Chinese in the region. And I'm guessing folks in here are less ignorant than I was, but I want to start by posing a question to all of you. And here it is. So historians estimate that in our region, so by our region, I'm saying east of the Cascades, west of Spokane, north of Walla Walla, say this whole spot that is us in the middle of the state. So if they're estimated in 1870 to be 800 white immigrants, 800 white immigrants, how many Chinese do you think were here? There were 800 whites, how many Chinese do you think? And what do you think they were doing for work? And I'm going to give you a few minutes just to talk to the people sitting next to you and see what you can come up with. How many Chinese do you think there were here? And what do you think they were doing for work? See what kind of answers you can come up with just visiting for a minute.
Can we Google it?
It won't be on Google, I'll guarantee that.
Yeah.
All right, who has to guess? Just call it out. How many Chinese do you think were here if there were 800 white immigrants?
Lots.
Lots. All right, there's enough for lots. 801, okay, maybe. Anybody else?
200.
200, that seemed about, I think that's probably what I would have thought. Yeah, about 200, about a quarter as many, but a good substantial number. Anybody else with a guess? A number? I'm gonna throw it out there.
I don't know, I'm kind of higher than 200, but I don't know how high.
Yeah. The number is 1,600. So it was twice as many. There were twice as many Chinese in our region as there were white immigrants at that time. I never would have imagined that. Never. What do you think they were doing for work? What were they doing?
Railroad.
Railroad. That's exactly what I would think, right? Railroad. Anybody have other thoughts?
Laundry.
Laundry, sure. What, anybody else?
It's been mining.
They were mining, right? No. Logging. They were doing planting, right? So I was thinking railroad too, because that's a stereotype. Turns out the railroad wasn't anywhere near Chelan Falls at that time, right? So they weren't yet working the railroad. What were they doing? Everything else you mentioned, right? Laundry, logging, farming. They were bakers. They were, they were anything you needed, they were doing. They were thriving in the area at that time. But most of them, the largest number of them, were mining. So the story of mining in our region in the West, we all know the 49ers down in California, right? They're down there at Sutter's Mill and they're mining in California. That kind of runs out and they start hearing about the Yukon, right? There's gold in the Yukon. Well, if you're going to get from California to the Yukon, you're going to come through our region, right? A lot of them went on the west side, of course, the waterway, but a lot of them came on the east side of the mountains. And they came up the east side in Oregon, they came through Walla Walla, got resupplied. When they came up through this area, they came through Moses Coulee. Does anybody know Moses Coulee? It's north of here a little bit. It's just one of those coulees coming up, running north or south, and it spits out right at Chelan Falls. So they're going to cross Lake Columbia and they're going to they're going to the Yukon. They got no use for any of this, but why not give it a try? Why not mine any place, the white miners come along, they try it out. There's a place called Rich Bar near Pateros where they did pretty good. But mostly they didn't do great. So they just kept right on moving straight up the Okanagan through BC to the Yukon. Right after them, the Chinese miners come along, and lo and behold, they start doing really well. And why are they doing well? What did people say about why they do well and the white miners didn't? Any guesses? Yeah.
They work harder.
They work harder. That is exactly what I had always heard.
They also specialize in a lot of areas. Work.
This is really important. So I thought everything you read, they work harder. They were harder workers, right? Well, maybe they were, or maybe they weren't. But this idea of specializing becomes important. So there's a scholar at Washington State University, Dr. Hsu, who has done a lot of work and lists three major reasons. So one is that they came from the Pearl River region, Guangdong of China, where they've done irrigation for 10,000 years. So they knew how to work with water. So the first bit of technology that they had, that the white miners hadn't come up with, is a rocker. Has anybody ever seen a rocker? They're using it here. The rocker is a real simple wooden contraption, so that instead of panning with a little pan like we always see in the pictures, they dump the gravel and onto the screen on the top level, and they pour water over it. And on the lower level is quicksilver or mercury to catch the gold dust. So the one reason the Chinese miners are doing well is they're catching the dust. They don't have to find a big nugget. They can catch that gold dust. So the technology that they brought with them, and not just this little rocker, but they had things like, this is called a long tom. It looks just like an orchard flume, right? They would divert the water from the stream, and then they just have to pour the dirt in. And again, there's quicksilver, there's mercury, it catches all the gold dust. But one thing you can see in this picture is that you can't run a long tom by yourself. You have to work communally. And most of the white miners, as far as we know, were individualistic. They were trying to get rich on their own. They were working on by themselves or in pairs, but the Chinese almost always worked communally, as you can see here. And here we've got, looks like the white miners working with them, anybody that can get in on the project. So we have the technology, we have them working communally. And there's one more super fascinating to me reason why they did better. They're much smaller. They were very small people. The average Chinese miner was 4'10". It was a very small human being to be working that hard. But they lived in, and we're going to see this in a minute, these little villages or these little communities, and they always had gardens. They were eating greens. They were just a lot healthier than the white miners were. They were eating vegetables. They also often had herbs, so they had a doctor and an herbalist there. So if they got sick, they could be healed. So that's what Dr. Xu says. There's 3 reasons that they were doing better. I find that so interesting, things I never knew. And here's the Chinese store right across from the Chelan River is coming in on the left side, and then the Chinese store there. This is an 1880 plat, and you'll see several plats like this. If you look through them, they all call it the same thing, Chinese store. That's what there is, the Chinese store. But it wasn't just the store there. They had a pack string that they would take down to Walla Walla. He worked, the merchant worked with Wapato John, who was a well-known Indigenous person in the region, to go down and get supplies down through Moses Coulee. They had a 10-person rowboat, so they could ferry people across or up and down the river. This is a thriving business, right? They're logging, almost certainly bringing in driftwood and making lumber out of it. They're doing all of these things. And I spent a long time trying to imagine. I'm a writer, so I'm trying to imagine what all of this looks like. And this is how research always goes. I'm trying so hard to write it over and over, and somebody says, "Oh, would you like a picture?" So I got this picture. This is one of the places where I really need your help. I got this picture from the Chelan Historical Museum, and it's almost certainly a later version of the village than the era we're talking about, but you can see that Chinese architecture, right? Those curved roofs. There's some stables in the back. The store is probably here in the front, and then further down closer to the river would be where the ferry came in, where the boat was docked and whatnot. But what we don't know is where it came from. I said, the Chelan Museum, where did you get this? They said, we don't know. We don't know where. If anybody knows where this picture came from, or what year, what photographer took it, or if you know somebody to ask, I am dying to know where this came from. But it is certainly the store that was there. And there was this merchant. This merchant is famous. He comes up over and over in reports of the region, and they always call him old. He was an old merchant. And merchant is a different class in China than a laborer, so he comes from a higher class. He was, well liked. Everybody liked him. Everybody came to his store. Everybody did business with him. There was no name for him, but there is another Chinese man from the region who is well known, whose name is known from that era, and his name is Chisa. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Does anybody know? Yeah.
Familiar, but I don't.
Anybody, there's a little tiny town up in the Okanagan, right? If you go and you just go a little bit east, then you end up in Chesapeake. Probably 60 people live there now. It is the only town in the whole United States that's named for a Chinese American. It's named for a man who went by Chesaw, who had a store up there, who married an Indigenous woman named Susan Lum. His descendants lived there for a long time. His descendants are now up in Osuyos and mostly in Canada. I started thinking, and I wasn't the first, other people have thought of this too, that maybe our merchant and that merchant are the same. Maybe they're the same guy. And so I started going through the census records. And this is a little hard to see. This is 1878, it's later on. But there's a gentleman named Ah Chi, and Ah means sir or uncle or mister, right? Ah Chi. So it's the same Chi as Chesaw. He's 38 years old, that's old. That's old in that era. And there's also a place marked where he's married and where he's literate, which would suggest that he's from a higher class. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, is it the same guy? I decided that it was. I think that Achi and Chesaw were the same man. So why did he leave this fancy story, Scott, and go up to the Okanagan? One thing that happened is that in 1872, there was a huge earthquake. Has anybody heard this story? There's a sign if you're along the road from Wenatchee to Chelan where it commemorates the earthquake because it was so big. The rocks came down and blocked the Columbia, and people could run back and forth for a couple of days across the Columbia. So people say, well, he took off in 1872. That earthquake was the end of that. And but if you go to Wenatchee, there's another store in Wenatchee, Sam Miller's Trading Post, and we have all of the ledgers from that store, from that era. And guess who's shopping at Sam Miller's store? Achi is, right? And a lot of Chinese, you can recognize the names as being people from Chinese descent. They're shopping there through the early 1870s, through 1873. That's after the earthquake. 1874. That's after the earthquake. 1875. They're gone. They disappeared. They're not on the ledger at all. That's the year of the supposed death. Maybe Achi heard it was coming. Maybe he saw it happen. But something made him say, that's enough. I'm going up the Okanagan. So just trying to piece it together. We don't know what's happening here. But we know from what we've been saying that the Chinese were thriving, right? They were thriving in this region. They were doing well. But it wasn't all peaches. This is hard to see from where you are, but this is a phrase book, an English Chinese phrase book. It's called the Wong Sam phrase book, and this you can actually Google because these fantastic scholars uncovered it in the 90s. And you would go to like a Wells Fargo station where the Pony Express was, and you could pick up this book. It's almost 300 pages long with all these phrases that you would need to know. And it speaks to, they had to be not only literate, but literate in 2 languages to use this phrase book. And they were giving out a lot of this phrase book. So there were people using it. All very interesting. But then you start reading the entries, and this is just a random page that I pulled from the phrase book. They're all about like this. And I'm going to read you a couple seem pretty normal. What goods have you for sale? Okay. I want to get a pair of your best pants. Okay. Then suddenly it starts getting a little sinister. He assaulted me without provocation. I struck him accidentally. The house was burned on accident. It starts to seem like the life they were living was pretty fraught. It wasn't all so wonderful in that era. So, I'm trying to follow up on who might have done this, and I start hearing this rumor that it wasn't the Indigenous people. There are records of skirmishes between the Chinese and the Metals, especially the Metals between Lake Chelan and Okanagan, and there were lots of skirmishes there between the Chinese and the Indigenous people, so that's for sure. Another thing is that there was a law in China that women could not emigrate, they could not leave, right? this is a great way to make sure that your immigrants come back, right? They wanted the men to come back. And so we know that Achi and other Chinese miners, as men everywhere will do, took wives, and they would have been Indigenous women. So now we've got, not only are they moving in on the territory, but there may be some jealousy because of that. We have some motives for why Indigenous people would have done this. But again, as I read in that passage earlier, there were all kinds of rumors. I started to hear that it was not Indigenous people, that it was white men dressed up as Indigenous. And there's a long history of this in our country, all the way back to the Boston Tea Party. They would make their skin brown. They could use walnuts or they could use shoe polish, and they might do it to explain, to say it was those bad Indians that did it. They also did it kind of just to be, savage. The same reason you name a football team the Washington Redskins, So there is precedent. This could happen. This is the only written source of the rumor, and it's attributed to a woman named Marjorie Patty McGrath, who lived up on the Waterville Plateau, and she wrote some really cool stories, pioneer and pigtails, stories of just living there in the era. And she talks a lot about a later merchant who took over the store once Chisaw's out of there. The store is still there. And this gentleman named Cheo Yu, whose picture is up in the Chelan Museum, he was a well-known merchant and, respected member of the community. He said it was white guys that did it. So that's where we start getting that rumor through Marjorie Patty McGrath to Cheo Yu. But I didn't know. I was baffled at this point. Where else can I turn? And everybody in the Chelan area told me about one man whose name is Randy Lewis. Did anybody heard of Randy Lewis? Randy's an amazing elder with the Wenatchee people. He is a political activist. He's a storyteller. And I really wanted to talk to Randy Lewis, but he's hard to chase down. So I went to the Wanapon Heritage Center down on the river, and they have annual archaeology days. Has anybody ever gone to archaeology days? Go to archaeology days. It's in October. It's so cool. They have demonstrations of flint napping and tanning hides, and archaeologists talking about different projects, and they feed you this feast, huge feast. They have salmon, and they have fried, and they have the jelly from the choke cherries. They're wonderfully generous people. So I was thrilled to be there. And not only that, but I elbow up in line while I'm waiting for food, and there's Randy Lewis. So I'm going to pick up the story there. Randy Lewis is a tall man, more than a foot taller than me, quick-witted, with a disconcertingly steady gaze, warm and skeptical at once. Google him, and you'll learn he's a veteran of the American Indian rights movement of the 1970s, a participant in the occupation of Alcatraz, an author, and a dedicated keeper of oral tradition along the Columbia River. Meet him in person and you get straight talk. What do you know about the Chelan Falls Massacre? I asked. Oh, you mean the time when the white guys dressed up like Indians? I nodded uncertainly. Do you know exactly where it happened? I hadn't been able to figure it out. Over by the springs, he said. He described a pullout where I walked near BB Springs, not a location anyone else had ever mentioned, but one that made a lot of sense. And so it was the white guys that did it. Yes, he said, no hesitance whatsoever. They always say it was the Indians, but a couple of Chelans were put in jail, but that's not what happened. I had never heard of anyone going to jail. He told me his great uncle, as a boy, overheard a group of white men bragging about the murders in a corner tavern. This would have been years after the actual event. The town grown larger, I pictured the boy pushing a broom over rough sawn floorboards. You know that tavern, Randy asked. We were holding overflow full paper plates of food and holding up the line too. I do, I said. He nodded as if that sealed the deal, and he walked away. So I've got him as a source that it was, in fact, white people, but this location that he's talking about. Yeah, so this is just generally what it looks like, what those bluffs look like. That you can see the gorge, the Chelan Gorge is right here coming in up there. One theory I have was maybe it happened up the Chelan River instead of into the Columbia, because none of these cliffs look exactly like a bluff that would drop someone into the river, right? But the place that he's talking about is off the screen to the right of BB Springs. And so I'm at this archaeology days, and I remember again these things that happen when you're researching. It's like, oh yeah, I know an archaeologist who's really an expert in this area because I worked for the National Park Service and he works for the National Park Service, and Bob Mierendorf must be here. So I find Bob, and I'm going to ask Bob about what happened, what he knew. He said he didn't know much, but there was something, he said, nodding thoughtfully. He called out to I will call Vicky, standing in the crowded lobby, an old friend of his who had worked on the BB Bridge project. He explained my interest. So I should say, what he did say was that he had done a dig there before they put in the park to see if there were any indigenous artifacts. So that's what they're talking about. He explained my interest in the massacre and asked if she remembered the dig. Yes, she said. She answered breathlessly, almost nervously. In fact, it was the strangest thing. They were doing test excavations, she explained. Their heads would be down in this tiny hole, and as she was digging alone in her assigned area, she kept feeling a presence, like hearing the sound someone makes when approaching, tools jangling, or footsteps. She'd come up and look around and not see anyone. I don't remember hearing voices, she said, not exactly. At some point, she decided enough is enough, and just that, waiting. Something made me think of the Chinese. Maybe one of the landowners had mentioned them and alluded to trouble, but I certainly hadn't heard about the massacre, not back then. I learned about that much later. Did you feel spooked? I asked. Yes, she said, that is the word for it. She paused and then added one thoughtful detail. The thing is, it felt like children. You know the way kids like to romp? It felt like a child ran by, that brush or breeze. Children, I asked. She nodded. The conversation flagged. Her story was too chilling, too hard to process. So we retreated into easier territory. Where exactly were they? Bob believed it was closer to the store. But Vicky disagreed, and she had no patience for guessing games. She pulled up Google Earth on her phone and pointed to an alluvial fan protruding into the river north of the bridge, now covered in orchards, a place not mentioned in any version of the story I'd heard. It was, in fact, on the opposite side, so the side, our side, in the picture, from where every single existing description places the massacre, almost directly across from BB Springs, where Randy Lewis had said the massacre occurred. She said she was 100% sure that's where she had been. As we talked, Randy Lewis passed by, headed toward the patio where the last of the afternoon sunlight reflected off the river. He reached out to touch his arm. Randy, wait, which side of the river did you say the massacre was on? Well, actually both sides, he said, right there by the springs and also across the river. They killed the men on one side and the women and children on the other. I was stunned. Not one account of the massacre had suggested massacres on two sides of the river. None had mentioned women and children. Randy had never met Vicky. There was no way he could have overheard our conversation in the crowded lobby. When we described Vicky's experience to him, he nodded solemnly as if to say, of course. Randy Lewis was the only one among us completely unsurprised that the truth might be radically different from any story we've been told. So yeah, the story is getting messy, right? And there's no way we're going to find factual evidence of this, of a ghost story that an archaeologist has, right? Is it therefore not true? Is it not real? I continued on my quest. Randy is, of course, an elder with the Comanche people. This is Arnie Marchand, Arnie is an elder with the Okanagan folks. He is an author. He works at the Depot Museum in Oroville, Washington. And that's where I met him. And so I go into the museum and I'm talking to Arnie and I say to him, do you know anything about the Chelan Falls Massacre? And he says, oh yeah, that's when we killed all the Chinese. So wait, the indigenous people did it? And he says, yep, we killed 700 of them. Well, what am I going to do with that? I just said, okay, we had a conversation about other things. Later I went back because I'm not going to put that in a book without asking him again. I went back and I asked him again. He said, yeah, 700 of them. That's what I heard. But he also said, and you know what? Forget about those Chinese. They were here for 10 years. They were here for 20 years. Listen to me tell you about the indigenous people of this region. So that is Arnie's perspective, right? I spent a day with him. What he kept saying is, forget John Wayne, forget that whole era. We have been here for millennia, right? Let go of that. So I'm writing this book. I'm trying to tell this complicated story. And I felt like I had to honor Arnie Marchand's version of the story, just like I had to honor Randy Lewis's side of the story. But I still doggone it want to know what happened. So Arnie says, well, I don't know, but my friend Dorothy will help you. He says, Dorothy loves things like this. Dorothy, it turns out, Dorothy Petrie is 92 years old. She is volunteer at the museum there and with the Historical Society, and she is one heck of a researcher. I got Dorothy on board as a pen pal, email pen pal. She knew sources I didn't know, and I knew sources because she's right there by Chesaw. She's really interested in Chesaw. And we've done this for months. She was so helpful, so wonderful. And finally, she says, you want to come find Chisaw's grave? I've always wanted to find Chisaw's grave. I said, heck yeah, I want to come find Chisaw's grave. So here I am. There's Dorothy. We've got some other friends out there. We're going through some barbed wire fence. We're going to go out looking for Chisaw's grave. And I mean, we've set this up. This is Mike and Kay Sibley from the Historical Society, her daughter, Ellen. I don't know if they all know what's going to happen, but I know what's going to happen. And we get out there, and Dorothy pulled out her crystal. So she's going to douse, she's going to ask the crystal about what the graves are. And I will tell you again, it would be very easy for me to stand here and make fun of that. But Dorothy believes it, right? Dorothy believes it, and she has put her heart and soul and her researcher's soul into this faith. And so we spent a very interesting day, and you can read all about it in the book, looking for Chisaw's grave, things she found it. And I said, please come down to Phoebe Bridge Park with me, right? Please, let's go looking for the site of the massacre. Bring your friends and bring the crystal, and we'll go grave dousing down there. But before I tell you about what happened there, you can tell at this point, it's starting to seem like it could be a made-up massacre, right? There's so much craziness around it. So what I really wanted to do was to find that 1892 article, the original article that reported this incident. And I had been looking for a long time. And finally, on the microfiche in the basement at Whitley College, I found this Chelan Falls Leader article, which I could tell, had quotes from. I knew it was a reprint of, or at least a version of the original article. So we were getting close. And then once again, someone said to me, have you called the spokesman review? So I called the spokesman review and they said, sure, we have. And they sent me the article. And here what we have is we have the Chelan Falls version. But what I will tell you about it, it is full of purple prose. You know what I mean by purple prose? Overly descriptive, super flowery, nostalgic for this Chinese store and this terrible massacre that occurred when the Indians came upon the Mongolians. I mean, this terrible phrasing. But one thing that I find really interesting, and the way I have this slide this way, is that the article appears in the same issue as an editorial called No Chinese. So one interesting thing about 1892 is that at the same time in the city of Wenatchee, they were just getting incorporated as a city. And they wanted to put into their original charter that no Chinese could live there. So it was a very, very strong. Now, you know, when I told you, Chinese have been there for 30 years by now, but they don't want them in the city. They have no use for them. And forgive me, this is some strong language, but I just want to read a little bit from this editorial from the editors of the Chelan Falls Leader in the same issue as the article about the massacre. It starts out saying there have never been Chinese here. There have been a few at various times scattered along the river, engaged in placer mining, and there used to be a Chinese store not far from here, but all that remains to mark the place is two lone graves where two luckless Mongolians lie, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. More of them are likely to be in that same fix if they don't stay away from here. We have no objection to the Chinese in China. He has the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as other human beings have, but his tastes and mode of life are so dissimilar and distasteful to white people. He comes so near to being human swine. He is so full of leprosy and opium. He is so altogether undesirable that we have no use for him. I'll leave that there for a second.
Was that about the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act?
It was 4 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that's where we're getting from here. I'm going to continue down this avenue of talking about the possibility that the massacre did not take place, that there weren't 300 people lived there. But before I do, I want to be clear, right, about the actual violence that did occur, that is documented against Chinese immigrants in the American West. So 1871, the Los Angeles Massacre, if anybody's ever been to Olvera Street, right in downtown Los Angeles, that was originally Chinatown. There's a great Chinese museum right there. And in that spot, in 1871, 19 Chinese were murdered by the white folks in Los Angeles. The late 1870s, the Chinese businesses were burned in San Francisco. We think of that as a thriving Chinatown, but all that we have of that is what came after they were burned at that time. And then finally, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 10 years, prevents all Chinese skilled and unskilled laborers from entering. And this is the first law restricting immigration in our country. And it was to keep the Chinese out. And not only did it keep the Chinese out, but if you were already here, like our friend Na Chi or Chi Sa, and he wanted to go home, like immigrants do, he wanted to see his family and then come back, it was just 8 weeks on a boat, he could not come back, right? You were not allowed re-entry. And so in some ways you would think that the Exclusion Act then would solve the problem, but it actually, the violence intensifies after the Exclusion Act. It's almost as if it gives permission to the violent acts. 1885, the worst act we know of, unless the Chelan Falls Massacre is worse. Rock Springs, Wyoming, at least 28 Chinese miners were dead in that massacre. And the saddest thing, the hardest thing for me when I read about that one is that the people who perpetrated the massacre were people who lived in this tiny village with the Chinese and had for some time. So I live in Stahika, a town of 80 people, and I try to imagine, what if all of a sudden, like, we started murdering our neighbors over this kind of hate? 1885, the Tacoma expulsion of the Chinese population. Does anybody know about the Chinese expulsion? Yeah, so they actually just, they didn't massacre them, but they kicked them out. They put them on boats and sent them off out of the city. And these events are getting more well known. There was actually an opera about the Tacoma exclusion last fall. And then finally, a really big one, 1887, the Hell's Canyon Massacre. You all know where Hell's Canyon is, right on the Oregon-Idaho border down there. And there had been rumors, just like Chelan Falls, for years and years of this massacre. But a journalist named Greg Noakes at the Oregonian decided he was going to find out the truth of this. And I thought I was going to be Greg Noakes, but I'm not so far. But he went in search of it, and he kept digging, and he found that the white men who had killed 34 miners had bragged about it in their diaries, in their journals. And somebody found the written accounts of exactly what they did. So there is now a monument at the site in Hell's Canyon that's written in English, Chinese, and Nez Perce language and ceremonies to honor those who went before. So there is certainly precedent. I don't want in any sense to say that these stories of what happened to the Chinese were made up. But there is such thing as made up massacres. This is one in Almo, Idaho. And there's been this monument there for a long, long time. And I'll read what it says. Dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in a horrible Indian massacre, 300 immigrants, and only 5 escaped. There is a historian who spent his entire career debunking this. This did not happen. It absolutely did not happen. The Shoshone people have begged the people of Almo and Idaho to take this down. They will not take it down. I have a historian friend. When I was first starting my research, I was asking him about it, and he said, "Oh, Anna Maria, people love their massacres." What the heck was he talking about, right? But here the people of Alma want to hang on to that idea that something happened. And so I'll turn it over to you guys again. And this is a question to chat with your neighbors about. Why did anyone make up a massacre? This one or any other? See what you can come up with, and we'll talk about it. So just spend a couple minutes trying to think of a reason you would make up the story of a massacre, especially the Chelan Falls Massacre that we're talking about.
Maybe one trigger. Yeah, just too much social media could be pass them on to the local bars. I think really back if we were trying to do this.
All right. Who has a theory? What would be a reason for a made-up massacre? Yeah, what do you got?
Great publicity and fear.
Create publicity and fear, and sometimes those things go hand in hand, right? Okay, fear of what?
Fear of retaliation or an event that never happened.
Fear of retaliation, right? It never happened, but now those Chinese might come back at us, right?
Yep.
Excellent. What else? What other reasons?
It's a justification for your own actions. If you do something else.
It justifies. It's a total, right? And it just justifies whatever we do from there on, right? Yeah. The most famous massacre I ever heard about growing up was Whitman Massacre, right? At the Whitman Mission,
Yeah.
which did occur, right? Indigenous people did kill a white family, and yet we used it for 50, 100 years to justify whatever we did to Indigenous people thereafter. So that's what you're talking about. Any other reasons you can think of? Yeah. Revenge. Yeah, revenge for whatever. Right? Something could have happened. And making up this story to villainize them might be a kind of revenge. It also makes them look really, really, there are 2 things about the Chelan Falls Massacre. One is it could explain why they disappeared. When I was in Chelan, I would often say, what happened to all the Chinese people? And people would say, well, you know about the massacre. Well, exactly it. They faced so much oppression. There were laws to keep them out. There was intense taxation, but it's easier to say there was a massacre. Yeah. The other thing it does in this case is it villainizes the Indigenous people, the Indians, right? It's like, look at those savage Indians, what they did to the Chinese. You get a twofer there, right? You get why the Chinese are gone and why the Indigenous people are to be feared. So lots of reasons why there could be a made-up massacre. I still did not want to believe it was made up. Told you about Dorothy coming back to the site. The first day was so much fun when I was in Chesaw and we were looking for that grave. When she came down to Chelan Falls, I have to say that it was not very too much fun. Because we would go to different sites and she would be kind of overwhelmed with emotion. And she'd say, yeah, something happened here. And then we'd go to another site and she'd say, something happened here, right? And we'd go to another site until it was too much for, I wasn't gonna ask her to do it anymore. I said, that's enough, Dorothy, let's go to the Apple Cup and have a slice of pie, right? Let's be done with this. But maybe there was truth in that, right? That there wasn't one massacre, but there were many events that happened, many episodes of violence. One thing that always bothered me is that there were no bones, there were no history of the remains here. And this is a big deal, especially in Chinese culture, because to them the bones are important. And when Chinese miners died here as immigrants, the 6 companies who were big companies that employed a lot of the Chinese miners, sort of as indentured servants in a way, they hired bone collectors. And you can read the accounts of which bones they had to find for each body and how they had to label it, and they had to put it in a special box and then send it back to the village in China where these people were from. And they did this for thousands of Chinese miners. So there are their remains, they're labeled in China. And I kept thinking, if only I could find someone with connections in China who could look and see if that's what happened, if they ended up. Finally, I discovered Dr. Raymond Chong, who writes a lot about Chinese history online. He has a blog. He's an engineer by trade. Doctor is the PhD. But he had gone back and met his relatives in Guangdong region and knew a lot about the region. And he said, I will look into it. I will look and see. He also spent a lot of time, he's got an engineer's mind, and he has a brother with that same kind of mind, analyzing all the information, all the documents I have to see what there is. And he's the one who finally said, I don't think so. I don't think there was a big event. There may have been, like you suspect, several small events, but there's just no record of these bones. So I could have at that point said, okay, 5 years, no project, no book. There's no answer here. There's nothing. Right as I was starting to think that, the COVID hit. And you remember at the beginning of COVID, what people were saying about the flu?
It came from China.
That they were calling it the Chinese flu, right? And Time Magazine had a cover story about violence against Asian immigrants in our country. This isn't a story about the past. This is a story about how we behave as Americans, right, under stress in these situations. I'm just going to read a little bit from near the end of the book, a chapter called "Problem with Make Believe," and then I'll open it up to your questions. This brings us to a crucial point about believing in made-up massacres. Not believing in real ones is worse. As troubling as it may be to dredge up our past, deniers of atrocities have done far more damage with motives far more insidious. From the Holocaust to 9/11, deniers have fostered dangerous debunking. In the case of the Holocaust, denying the gas chamber deaths of 6 million humans nurtures anti-Semitism as kindling for the next conflict. I wrote that long before now. In the case of Native Americans, denying the horrors allows descendants or benefactors of those who stole land and killed women and children and decimated species like the American bison to cleanse ourselves of guilt. There was no outright Holocaust of Chinese people in the West, but there was systematic repression, a squeezing out. There were mass murders, some gruesome enough to earn the moniker of a massacre, and many small-scale events, like the murders of hops pickers in the Squaw Valley outside Olympia. There was also the long chain of violent exclusions from Eureka, California to Bellingham. Even as Chinese Americans acted with valiant resistance, the forces of tyranny accrued against them. About that, there's no titillating intrigue, no mystery, no doubt whatsoever. A somber note to end on, but I am more than happy to entertain your questions. or any thoughts you have, any information you have for me, I would love to hear. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so if the bodies were supposedly pushed over, what are we thinking about bones?
Because they would think they would wash up. Yes, was the idea. And there actually were some that washed up near Rock Island, if you know where that is. That is a long, long way from, it seems unlikely that those would have been the bones, but some people point to that and say, look, they did wash up down there. And in Hell's Canyon, the bones did wash up further down. That's how they knew it had happened. They just didn't know who had done it, right? Yeah. Other questions or comments and thoughts?
Wasn't there something in Seattle?
You know, I don't know about Seattle. There's a long-standing myth in Bellingham that a massacre occurred and the bodies were buried in tunnels underneath the city, which might be conflated with Seattle because Seattle has the tunnels. I'm pretty sure that that has been debunked, but again, might have roots in some truth. There's also a story from China Point near Roslyn. Does anybody know that story? Yeah.
Well, my dad was telling me he grew up here.
Mhm.
Like many generations have been here of my family, but he was talking about Chinaman's Curve,
Okay.
something about with the railroads,
Okay.
and then Chinaman's Point.
Okay.
I did come across on the internet a gentleman's thesis from
Yeah.
the University of Washington.
An undergraduate.
Yes,
Yeah,
you
right?
read that.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
Tell us the
they're
story.
Very similar. I think it's the same story
Right?
that you've had here, but they've changed location.
And or people say that it's the Hell's Canyon story and that that's been conflated with all of these locations, that it was one massacre, but now people say it happened at China Point and or at Chelan Falls for all of that, which is possible. But isn't it also possible that there was violence elsewhere besides Hell's Canyon and that nobody thought to write it in their journal for a newspaper and the fun,
Right.
you know, years down. But yeah, that's so interesting.
But
that
he didn't come to a conclusion whether it was true or not. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
Priscilla Wiegers, who's the kind of the known authority on the Chinese in this region at the University of Idaho. She has kind of came out strongly that China Point was, she doesn't believe that happened. And I'm not quite sure why she decided that, except for, you know, just not even a written account. At least Chelan Falls, we have this Spokane spokesman
Right.
article, so you have something right to go with. But yeah, the stories abound. They just abound.
So this is weird, but like I'm wearing my Stehekin sweatshirt. But that was this last summer was the first time I've been to Chelan before, but not just to see Stehekin or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But we took the ferry to Stehekin, and on the way back, we met one of the locals, and he told me and one of my friends to go up to Chelan Falls and do this back road.
Yes.
And I actually have pictures of this on my camera. And it was almost frightening how steep those ravines are. And you could kill somebody and they'd be there forever. You wouldn't know it.
That exact spot is where
It's still a dirt road. And I think a lot of people don't even know about it. It's beautiful.
It is so scenic. Yeah, but it is so scenic, and it just goes along that Chelan River Gorge, looking down. You think you're looking into southern Utah or something, the way the rocks and everything are. In the first chapter of the book, again, I'm giving away the book, but I went out with a friend of mine along that road, and we were looking at spots.
Yeah.
And one of the theories about the massacre is that it wasn't 300 people killed, that it was 300 feet up. So the numbers got completed. Well, we went out with this friend of mine, and he's a real jovial fellow, right? And he got really somber. And we stood out on one of those rocks that juts out. And he says when he was a kid, you know, young man, partying with his friends, one of his friends had gone out there to go to the bathroom and all and died. And he said that they had to go and they were firefighters, so they did the rescue themselves, that they know it was exactly 300 feet that he fell. So that, and it is also in view of the store. So that could be a location. It sure seems more likely than anything into the Columbia. But again, this isn't what Randy says, right? Randy's got another story about a different part of the different bluff in the area. Yeah, it is fascinating to try to parse it. But that was another place where I took Dorothy and she said, yes, 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 yeah. Other thoughts? Other theories? It is a somber note to end on, but I also, I think it's worth remembering that the Chinese thrived in our region, that they were original settlers of our region, that they had businesses, that he had a thriving, some people call it the store, some people call it the village, right? Because he had these gardens and he had the pack train and he had the ferry boat and all of that. That they disappeared is if not because of violence, probably because of oppression of some sort, the taxation, the Exclusion Act, the many forms of oppression that the city of Wenatchee trying to kick them out. I will tell you one positive story about, I mean, it's not very, but when they sat down to take the vote to keep the Chinese out of Wenatchee, one businessman stood up and said no. Noah Brown said no. Noah Brown had to leave town for a few years after that, but he came back and there's a hotel in Wenatchee that that Noah Brown owns. And so that at any juncture in these stories, you see, people who do the heroic thing, who do the right thing, who stand up for their neighbors in these situations. So.
I don't know how familiar you are, but down in the Wapato area, there's a Buddhist temple. And every year they have a sukiyaki dinner and it's a fundraiser for the Buddhist temple.
Fantastic.
And across the street, it's a little bit across the street from the temple, because they have the meal in the old gymnasium, is the Filipino cultural center.
Oh, fantastic.
And the Yakima History Museum has done a lot of work with the Japanese people that were interned.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a white couple that owned a store in Wapato and who gave space to the Japanese people to leave their belongings in their store, and they were ostracized, and their store was
plundered,
etc. And there's a really wonderful photograph of this couple at the temple, because when the people came back, they were like, here's your things.
Wow.
Wow. And so they've honored them in the temple there. And it's part of the whole narrative brought in a lot of the people in the valley that were still related, et cetera.
Right.
And they now have a cemetery, they actually have a Japanese.
So, yeah, those are the stories you also stumble on, right? Which are wonderful. And celebrating those. There's also, of all places in John, when you're driving down 97, there's actually a monument to a merchant there who was quite successful. And they've rebuilt kind of a replica of his store, and they have a lot of. Have you been there? Yeah, it's really tremendous and completely unexpected in that landscape. But I love how it's just placing that history as part of all the rest of the history that we know in our region and making it rich. Down in, I've spent some time in Whiskeytown, California. The Whiskeytown National Monument has a lot of Chinese history there in that region because the miners were in that region and left artifacts and history and their own culture. So it's so great to see things like that. Other questions? Thoughts, ideas? Well, I really appreciate it. Go ahead.
What made you want to write the book?
I really did feel, I really do feel like I love the region. Like this is my home, and that, like I said, a place comes to own you. I thought, well, the history belongs to me too. And I want to know what that history is. And I want to know the truth. And, even from the beginning, it was less about solving the mystery than it was just, oh my goodness, there was this merchant here who thrived, who had this store. So that's why not only is Massacre in the title, but the miners and the merchant are in the title. I just want that history to be part of my experience and your experience of the region that we live in, that we love. Yeah. Thanks for that question also. All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Yeah. I don't know. I'm saying we have copies of books. She'll happily sell me copies. I'll happily. Yeah.